Well, welcome everyone. This is our first online lecture, of which this will be section 1 of 3. Now, as discussed previously in class, we're looking at both research questions and evidence-based practice questions. This lecture is focusing in on how researchers develop questions for use in studies. In lecture 2, I will be discussing how you develop specific questions for use in reviewing the literature to understand issues in clinical practice. Now, the research process has a lot of mystique around it that makes it seem very abstract and foreign. However, at a fundamental level, it really is just an opportunity for clinicians and scientists to learn more about a question that they're really passionate about. In a sense, this is not abstract at all. These are real problems that affect people in meaningful ways, and especially when you're talking about health. And, gathering more information gives us the power to direct our energies in a way that has the greatest benefit for everyone. So, as you know, in order for findings of studies to make an impact, the information has to be distributed to others in the field. If a publication isn't clear, the likelihood of other clinicians actually using it goes way down. So it's an obligation of the researcher to make her ideas, logic, and justification and goals of her work very accessible. As a researcher attempts to lay out their ideas in a clear way, they will really focus in on specific components that one would typically expect to see in a research paper. And we'll talk a little bit during this lecture about what those components are. Well, I won't talk about the specific components in detail at this particular moment. A point that I'd like to make is that it is actually structured within a paper. And learning about where you can see different types of information will actually improve your ability to read papers faster and more efficiently to get an idea of what the author is trying to tell you. So how do researchers actually get their questions? Well, there's actually a bunch of different ways. I think one of the more common ones is actually through personal experience. Someone has something in their personal life or they see something happen in the clinic, which they think can actually be resolved by getting new data, and where there could actually be an impact on their patients, for example. Another way that people come to their ideas is through keeping on top of the literature in their field. So maybe you read a paper by a friend or someone you've met at a conference and you say, oh, maybe if I combine that idea with this other idea that I've read, maybe I could put that together and come up with this new question that would be really interesting, helpful for people. Another thing is a lot of researchers have real strong political motivations. They see things going on in the world around them, social problems that they think can be addressed by additional data. And a fourth way that one can also get ideas is to look at what different organizations, agencies, funding agencies are picking as being their key priorities for future directions in research. And that can help you pick out questions that are really significant and that could help move your field forward. Now, it's important to note when you're thinking about directing these questions that a question really needs to be researchable, in that it has to be something that you can ask questions about and collect data and analyze that data to answer that question. Now, there's some things like, for example, ethical questions that really can't always be entirely answered through data. Data can form those ethical questions, but you usually go through a different process of discussion in order to answer them fully. So research takes a lot of time, and any researcher worth their salt is actually not going to embark on a study unless they really think that it's significant. And that's something to really think about carefully before you start a study. So is it actually going to have an impact on someone? Is it going to improve practice or education of students, or improve administration so that it's more efficient? Is it going to help us improve current theories around health behavior, or even generate a new theory? And is it going to ultimately have an impact on patient care? Now, if something doesn't meet at least some of these criteria, you should really consider how you could modify your research question to improve it, to make it more significant, or perhaps abandon it and pursue another research question. Now, one of the first questions that you should ask, of course, is whether or not this question is actually going to be feasible to address in the context of research. So can it be tested in actual practice? For example, ethical questions usually can't be tested very easily. Is it affordable? Research is actually really expensive. If you think about it, a researcher typically is looking at one study which they do over a year or 2 years, and sometimes their research is entirely funding their salary and funding the salary of their graduate students, for example. So some studies can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. Another major question is, even if you have a really interesting project, you need to make sure that you can have access to the subjects that you would need to be able to talk to in order to do your study. So, for example, I used to work in an IRB that oversaw a lot of projects, and we had one study that came through, and they had only recruited 3 people over a period of about 5 years. And that's because the disease they were looking at was so rare that it was really hard to find people who they could talk to in their studies. Another thing to think about is time constraints. So if you're doing your PhD, for example, you want to get out of there at some point in time. You don't want to start on a 10-year-long study. So you need to think about what you can accomplish in the time that you have. Some research requires fairly extensive facilities and equipment in order to be accomplished. Do you have that equipment? Can you buy it? How expensive would it be? Those are really important questions to ask before you start on something. Also, a lot of research, especially interdisciplinary research, requires a range of different expertise. Do you actually know the things that you need to do to complete your study? And if you don't, can you actually find people who can work on that with you? Another thing is, are you really genuinely interested in this question? If you're not really passionate about the question, then you should stop right now, because it's a lot of work. Working on something for a year or so that you don't care about is just not gonna work out in the end. So you really have to be passionate about it. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about this in a later lecture. We'll talk about this for well over an hour, but you need to really think about whether or not a question is ethically appropriate. Given the different types of designs that you can have, there are certain things where you could potentially actually cause harm to participants, and those would be studies that would not be seen as being acceptable.